Okay. Are we all sitting comfortably? Hello, Fantasticon, virtually speaking. Thank you so much for coming to my session, whenever it may be. I have decided that I'm going to read for you. There's a surprise from one of my books, which I'm pretty sure all of you have already read. And if you haven't, you've probably heard me read a chapter of it, and possibly the chapters that I'm about to read. But the thing that is different about this reading, of course, is the fact that I'm currently in my new life. My Ferrets studio, Ferret Tube, which I've started in partnership with Mad Dog, who is operating the sound and the cameras. So if I look and sound rubbish, then it's all the dog's fault. But we've got ferrets. You can see they're actually just about to... Oh, that way. They're there. They're kind of just snuffling down. We've had a very, very active play. And they're now all sleepy, and the music you can hear in the background was composed for us. It's one of our theme tunes by the wonderful Neon Dan, who you all know as used to know as the Commander, Neon Dan. And we are here to celebrate Fantasticon and their amazing lexicon of authors, of whom I happen to be one, and this is one of those books. And my plan is now to actually, every Friday or so, it may not be every Friday, I may do a different day in the week or whatever, but I'll let you know on social media. But every Friday from now, I'll read a bit more of this until we finished it. So there you go. So you don't need to buy it anymore. But please do, if you've got somebody that you would like to gift it to, perhaps that would be a nice way to do it. Get that out of the way so it's not ruffling all the way. As you can see, by the way, it's a bit of a mess in here at the moment because we've just had playtime. So I apologise that I didn't have a chance to clear up all the tubage yet. Chapter... it's the Bookkeeper's Guide to Practical Sorcery is the name of the book, and it's the story that I had in my head since I was really a small girl. It was like, in musical terms, I guess you would call it my first album. And I think everybody who's ever sort of dreamt of writing a book their whole life, they have an initial story that gave them the kind of, I should write this into a book. And this is this for me. And after publishing my Elite Dangerous book, Elite Mostly Harmless, I was given the opportunity to give this a rewrite. I'd finished writing it 10 years before, and I gave it a rewrite, and Dan published it. So, and I know a lot of you have already got it and already read it. So apologies if you find this dull. But to spice things up, we do have adorable ferrets. So just ignore me, watch the ferrets. Chapter 1. Do you believe in magic? I see you pause for thought, perhaps to ponder, what is magic anyway? Where is the proof of it around me? But why must you see a thing for it to be real? Can you see the air that you breathe? Deny its existence all you like, but it will go on filling your lungs regardless. Magic, let me tell you, friend, is just as real. It flows across the earth as blood flows through your veins. You don't believe me? I see it in your eyes, the tolerant look of someone humouring a fool. But I hope to change your mind tonight, because unlike blood and the air that you breathe, magic does need faith to exist. Not much, just a trickle of belief from a special few, like the hidden roots of a cactus drawing life from deep below the desert floor. I wonder if your mind is open enough to become one of those roots, ensuring for another generation that magic survives. I'd like to tell you a tale, if I may, about a time when magic would have died were it not for one brave soul who fought a monster to save it. Perhaps you'll think it's a pleasant story and go along your way, your life unchanged. But I see more than that in your eyes. I see a deeper understanding that hints of something special. So sit, be comfy as we travel, friend. Perhaps my tale will sow in you the seed of belief that magic needs to keep on blooming. Henry Noble wasn't a particularly remarkable-looking young man. Small for his age, with a thoughtful face, the kind of face you'd skim right past if you were looking for trouble. Each morning at 6:15, he would pick up his lunch pail from the faded kitchen table, kiss his mother's cheek goodbye, and stride down the garden path, out through the neat little gate that leads onto the rest of the world. At the end of the road, he would turn right onto Market Street, skirting the shiny cobbles of the square, before winding his way west through rows of cheerfully fronted cottages towards the looming stone walls of the castle. Henry loved the square at this time of day. The worn trestles and empty stalls, still naked of the burgeoning produce, stood in tidy ranks that seemed to march purposefully towards the frowning grey castle above. The cobbles glistened in the early morning emptiness, polished to an impossible sheen each day by a stampede of hungry bargain hunters. Henry paused to enjoy the scene as a swift-tail looped down out of the clear blue sky to snag some morsel overlooked by nighttime scavengers. In the distance he heard the faint echo of hooves and cartwheels as the first of the day's traders began making their way blearily to their stations. Henry's walk to the castle wasn't very long, 20 minutes at most, but he liked to allow enough time to stop by the north wing on his way to work. This majestic stone tower was home to Halcyon, the Wizard Royal, and Henry's only true friend. Together they would sit and drink tea, chatting about the comings and goings in Terratonia. But the conversation always ended up in the same neighbourhood. "I need you to teach me, Halcyon. I can't go on like this. It's killing me inside." As usual, Henry's face was the picture of misery as he sat across the table from the wise old sorcerer. "You know I don't do that anymore, boy." The old man stood, leaning on the back of his chair so he could reach a large clay jar labelled biscuits down from off the shelf. "But it's so unfair. I've dreamed of this day my whole life, and instead I get stuck counting gold in the king's vaults." "At least you have work, dear boy. The shovels to buy what your family needs. There are far worse fates than becoming an accountant." Henry huffed, a rosy blush rising in his cheeks. "What about my needs? Don't they count too? I'm only 16 years old. I should be chasing dreams, not stuck in a dungeon counting someone else's money." The old man smiled at the earnest face before him. Henry had always been fascinated by magic. As a small boy, he'd often come to the castle with his father, the chief accountant. At the first opportunity, the boy would slip away from the counting vaults and seek out Halcyon in his chambers. The old wizard would charge up his wand with a colourful array of spells and charms to entertain the lad, whose eyes would grow as big as dinner plates. Normally quite shy, Henry would come alive while talking about how he would one day become a great and powerful sorcerer, leaping at imaginary monsters, brandishing a wooden spoon wand to demonstrate. The king's wizard would laugh and pat him on the head. The old man would laugh, patting him on the head, turning an apple into a twirl of butterflies to the squealing delight of his small visitor. "Your family needs you right now, Henry. Dreams can come later, when the twins are older and your mother's heart has mended." Henry's cheeks flushed again, this time fueled by guilt. He looked down sheepishly and dropped a lump of sugar into his tea. "I know, you're right. I'm just being selfish. I realise we're lucky the king gave me work at such a young age. Otherwise, where would we all be now? It's just, I wanted so much more out of life." "Cheer up, lad. Your life is just starting. Let's have a biscuit and you can tell me what's going on in town." Henry watched as the old man wrestled the cork lid of the jar, which seemed determined to keep the tasty treats to itself. Realising the futility of its efforts, it eventually popped off, flying out of Halcyon's hand to roll across the flagstone floor. Halcyon peered into the jar, smacking his lips. He stopped abruptly, his expression changing from hungry anticipation to absolute rage as he sprang to his feet and slammed the jar down on the table. "You!" he bellowed at the offending container, rifling with urgency through the folds of his robe. Henry inched back in his chair, staring at the jar. The jar squeaked, and Henry saw a tiny pink nose twitch its way over the rim. The nose was followed by a small pair of paws, and a mouse, rather fat and looking very pleased with itself, started hauling its tubby body out of the jar. Halcyon managed to untangle his wand from his robe and jerked his arm outwards, blasting a ball of crackling pink light into the jar. The mouse squealed and fell back inside. Henry gripped the edge of his seat. "That troublesome rodent has been snuffling my stacks for far too long. Well, not any more." Halcyon pulled the biscuit jar towards him and reached inside. He scooped out a plump, slimy, and very cross-looking toad. "You, my rascally little friend, are going to the pond." Halcyon waggled his wand sternly at the toad. The toad burped rudely and tried to squirm out of his grasp. But the old wizard held tight before plopping it in a wooden casket on the floor. He slammed down the lid with his foot. Henry felt sorry for the mouse. A jar full of biscuits must be an awfully big temptation, and it didn't look very happy about being turned into a toad. "Oh, don't worry, boy," Halcyon said, seeing Henry frown at the casket. "It's only a low-level spell. Lasts a little over a week if you get it right. He'll be back up here making off with my confectionery in no time, I doubt." Halcyon glared at the casket. "But not before a good soaking in the pond," he said loudly, rapping the lid with his wand. Another belch came from inside. The old wizard looked pleased with himself. He sat back down and pushed the jar across the table. "Biscuit?" Henry eyed the amphibious ooze now smearing the rim of the jar and shook his head. Halcyon raised his eyebrows and then dug deep for a handful of his own. "Now, where were we?" "You were reminding me my life isn't my own and refusing to teach me magic." Halcyon sighed, dunking a biscuit into his tea and swirling it around. "It's for your own good, Henry. Magic is no living. Not anymore. Not nowadays." His voice was sad. There was a time many scores of years gone by when men and women of magic had been admired and revered. The kings and queens of yesteryear would consult with their mystical consorts on affairs of state and the heart. Halcyon would stride through the cool, dark corridors of the castle with his head held high, his magnificent silken robes whipping importantly at the empty space he left in his wake. But that was then, and this was now. Magic had been getting a bad name lately, and many of the best wizards had been driven into hiding, branded charlatans and fraudsters by mobs of scornful townsfolk. Halcyon was one of the lucky few. Were it not for the high regard the king's father held him in, he too would no doubt be living a lie, beating out a meagre existence as a blacksmith or a baker, his tall pointy hat and emerald robes tucked quietly away in some dark, secret cupboard. He shuddered. "Besides, your mother would have my hat for a handbag if I led you off the straight and narrow. You're the head of the household, boy. Food and lodgings don't pay for themselves." Henry felt bile rise in his stomach at the injustice of it all. "But if I had magic, I could spell them into existence. Or better yet, go out and find the bandits that took my father and blast them to oblivion." Henry's fists were balled on the tabletop now. The old man reached across and patted one. "I know, lad, I know. Just give it time. It's only been 2 years, and the loss is raw for all of you. But right now, your family needs you." The old wizard watched the young man sadly for a moment, then remembered the biscuit dunked in his tea and pulled it out to inspect it. Henry relaxed his fists and sighed again deeply. 2 years feels like a lifetime in my shoes. At that moment, the tea-soaked biscuit decided it, too, had had enough of life, and a large chunk broke off the arrangement, diving headfirst back into Halcyon's cup. A droplet of tea sploshed onto Henry's nose. "Oops, sorry," Halcyon said, but couldn't help smiling as Henry wiped at it crossly. "Never mind." He scraped back his chair and got up. "I should head off now. I don't want to be late. That old misery Mr. Colloyd is just looking for another excuse to dock my wages." "Very well, boy." Halcyon stood stiffly, crossing the room to open the shutters. The bright spring morning burst rudely into the dusky old chamber, transforming it instantly from an intriguing cavern filled with secrets and promise into just another stone-clad box containing a bent old man with a slightly odd dress sense. The magic was gone, and Henry should be too if he was going to buy a chicken from the market that night. He'd already been docked 5 shebbles this week. If he lost much more, his brothers would be tucking into roast accountant instead of chicken, a dish his mother would be more than happy to prepare. The cool, damp corridor skirting the central courtyard was still deserted as Henry headed for the vaults, the sound of his heels tapping on cold grey flagstones echoing in the most satisfactory way. Most courtiers didn't surface before 10 o'clock, and Henry savoured these moments of peace as he wove his way through impressive chambers filled with ancient treasures. Despite the prospect of spending the next 8 hours under Mr. Colloyd's critical eye, he allowed his face to relax and try on a smile. It wasn't such a bad life, he mused, running his hand along the pleasing curve of the white stone banister leading down into his place of work. And yet, he craved more. It wasn't that he disliked the people he worked with, besides his miserable boss, of course, but the only magic they believed in down here was the magic of a carefully balanced ledger, and Henry found that stifling. The chief accountant was already sitting at his desk by the door when Henry arrived. He looked pointedly at his pocket watch, unable to conceal his contempt for the young man scurrying across the room. Henry's cheeks burned as he nodded polite greetings to colleagues left and right. Mr. Colloyd squeezed the pocket watch shut and stood, his heavy oak chair screeching an ugly complaint across the floor. He tugged at the bottom of his sombre black coat, and pushed steel-rimmed reading glasses even higher up on the bridge of his nose. "You are aware, Master Noble, that work begins at 8 o'clock sharp in this establishment, are you not?" His voice was high and nasal, his face pinched into a ferocious squint as he tried to focus on Henry through his reading glasses. Henry stopped and turned to face his employer. Yes, of course, Mr. Colloyd. 8 o'clock. Is it past that now?" Henry was sure he'd arrived on time. Mr. Colloyd's mouth curled up into a victorious sneer as he flicked the top of his pocket watch again, examining it closely for several seconds. "Simply being in one's place of employ is not to begin work, boy," he said eventually. "The time is now precisely 40 seconds past the hour of 8, and you have yet to count a single piece of gold." Henry stood in the middle of the room, all eyes on him. "Well, I've been standing here talking to you for about 40 seconds, otherwise I would have done." Injustice coloured his cheeks. Mr. Colloyd gasped, snapping the watch shut and levelling his gaze on the young man. But the short-distance lenses in his glasses, which were in a particularly mischievous mood, hiked his aim off to the right 10 degrees, and he wound up staring at a table instead. The table shook nervously. Mr. Colloyd snatched the treacherous glasses off their perch and stalked around his desk towards Henry, snarling, "You are sailing perilously close to the edge of your world, sonny. I should hate to see you fall off." Not scaring anyone, am I? Oh, she's asleep in the thing. Oh, we can't see her. She's asleep in the tube. Anyway, I should hate to see you fall off. Somehow Henry doubted that. I'm sorry, Mr. Colloyd, but his attempt at an explanation was brought to an abrupt halt by the clatter of coins bouncing across the stone floor. This sound was quickly followed by the frantic rustling of cloth as somebody tried to cover it up. Mr. Colloyd's head whipped around and he glared at the red-faced clerk who'd caused the commotion. "Cosset!" he roared. Peter Cosset shrank back in his soft leather boots, cradling the wayward coins in his tunic as he cowered in the edge of the room. I'm sorry, Mr. Colloyd," he stuttered. Seeing his chance, Henry scurried to his station, settling down and immediately starting the process of transferring towers of glittering gold coins from one side of the bench to the other. "Oh, you will be, boy," Mr. Colloyd's sneer broadened into a smug smile, "when you find your remuneration for today to be 5 shebbles light." He finished with a strangled squawk that roughly resembled a laugh and curled spiny fingers into the turn of his lapels. His icy eyes focused on the cowering accounts clerk, which, without the interference of the troublesome reading glasses, marked their target with devastating accuracy. Peter went back to studying the coins in the scoop of his tunic, and eventually the chief accountant stalked back to his desk. Henry felt sorry for Peter. The bullying overseer had made him so nervous that he was all thumbs and 2 left feet. He'd only been working in the vaults for a month and a half, and he'd already been docked 25 shebbles. Much more, and the poor lad would be paying to come into work. Henry watched as Peter pulled himself together, pouring the errant coins in his tunic onto a long wooden bench in front of one of the busily counting accountants. He dug in his pocket, pulled out a white handkerchief and blew his nose gently. Dabbing at his nostrils fussily, he noticed Henry watching him. He blushed and folded the hanky away neatly into his pocket, then went back to collecting stray coins. "Never mind, Peter?" Henry whispered as the young lad appeared from beneath his bench, clutching the last few runaways. "He's probably just having a bad day. Wouldn't you if you had to look at that face in the mirror every morning?" The clerk's mouth gaped in horror, his eyes flicking between Henry and Mr. Colloyd from behind a mop of unruly hair that seemed to sprout in every direction, despite evidence of an attempt to tame it with rather too much hair cream. "Shush, Henry! He'll hear you! My mother will ground me for life if I lose any more shebbles this month." Henry clamped shut his mouth. That was a feeling he knew only too well. Expected to come to work like a man down here, yet still treated like a child at home. Perhaps he had something in common with one of his colleagues after all. Peter sniffed and put the back of his hand to his forehead, seeming to test his temperature. "You okay?" Henry asked, with genuine concern. Peter blinked and seemed to resolve some internal conflict. "Yes, sorry, I'm fine." He tried on a tentative smile. Henry smiled back encouragingly. "I'll go get some more coins." Then Peter scampered off towards the lower vaults. Henry looked at the bench. Light from the paraffin lamps on the walls danced across the glittering stacks of gold. He went back to counting and allowed his mind to wander through the hypnotic patterns they cast on the worktop, his imagination transforming the light display into swirling garlands of magic he commanded to do his bidding. A shard of light here to fix his family's money troubles, a shaft of brilliance there to bring his father back, and a blade of pink luminescence spun across the room to turn his employer into a toad. A chuckle rose in his throat as he imagined tossing the nasty man into the pond with all the other slimy creatures. His imaginary spellcasting was broken when a shadow fell across the work surface, killing the shimmering reflections. "Count!" Bob Frugal's chalk was poised above a grey slate cradled in his arm. Henry's face remained blank. "Count!" Bob repeated, an edge of irritation creeping in. "Henry, for goodness sake, what count do you have?" Henry glanced down at the stack of coins laid out on the desk in front of him, his face growing hot as the awful truth dawned. He had completely lost count. An entire morning's work wasted. Mr. Colloyd was going to have his head on an abacus. That was chapter 1. And sad for us, our little girl, let's see, Cam, let's go Cam. Maybe we could go 4 + 1 and put the little girl back on camera B. So, what did you think? Oh, you like to? Did you think that I could see? Yeah. Charles Collingwood was really, really, really good. I'm not obviously Charles Collingwood, but I like to think I've got a fairly good understanding of the motivation of the characters. So hopefully my understanding of the characters... lovely, of course, but you're biased. Ah, yes, audiobooks as well. Audiobook is read by Charles Collingwood. So Fantasticon. This is my beautiful home with my beautiful babies. You can see there in that shot, in that kind of like, there's a bit of tube that goes like that, and you can see her, she's just sleeping in the tube there. She's been listening to my story, and I think the other little baby is in bed. Is she? I think she's up in the sleep box in the top, so you may have seen the sheets bumping up and down. But I hope you have a great time at Fantasticon. I will see you. I'm around all weekend. I'm doing my shows here on Saturday and Sunday for a couple of hours. But other than that, I'm going to be around here and in the, actually probably staying out of the rain, because it looks like it's going to be another absolute stinker of a rainy weekend this weekend. But... thank you for having me, Fantasticon 2020. Hopefully we can do it physically and not virtually next year. Stay safe, stay lovely, and stay safe out in the Black Commanders.